I came to help my son and his wife after their second baby was born. But on my first morning, my daughter-in-law slid a laminated schedule beside my coffee and said, "Your duties are highlighted in pink." I smiled, folded it into a coaster, and that was when everything changed. Chapter 1. The laminated expectation. Celeste wiped the kitchen counter with a damp cloth, watching her son Nolan pack his briefcase by the front door. At 64, she had spent 40 years balancing family responsibilities with demanding nursing shifts before retiring to a modest townhouse in Madison, Wisconsin. When Nolan invited her to stay for a month to help settle into their new neighborhood after Tessa gave birth to their second child, she expected a warm family reunion. Instead, she received a laminated spreadsheet titled Household Operations and Childcare Matrix, placed beside her coffee mug by Tessa. Tessa walked into the kitchen, adjusting her silk blouse with an air of brisk authority. She did not look at Celeste as she tapped a red marker against the kitchen island. "Mom, I highlighted your primary shifts in pink," Tessa said, her voice clipped and professional. "The children wake up at 6. Breakfast must be served by 6:45. The organic produce needs to be washed according to the chart on the refrigerator door. Nolan and I have extremely demanding careers, so we are counting on you to keep this household running like clockwork." Celeste lowered the dish towel, her gaze steady. The document listed 32 mandatory tasks per day, ranging from folding laundry with military precision to curating a sensory playtime routine. Tessa was treating retirement like an open vacancy for a live-in housekeeper. Without raising her voice, Celeste picked up the laminated sheet, folded it neatly, and used it as a coaster. Then she placed her steaming coffee mug directly on top of Tessa's carefully printed schedule. "Good morning, Tessa," Celeste said, her tone level and unhurried. "I am happy to spend time with my grandchildren, but I am not on the clock." Tessa's face tightened with irritation, her mouth opening to object. But Nolan hurried past them, kissing his wife's cheek and mumbling about missing his train. Tessa swallowed her retort, grabbing her car keys while shooting a sharp glance at the makeshift coaster. Celeste took a slow sip of her coffee, knowing this quiet refusal was only the beginning of a much larger collision. Chapter 2. The recurring spreadsheet. By Thursday morning, the household rhythm had settled into an uncomfortable friction. Celeste discovered that the laminated matrix was not a one-time suggestion, but a daily ritual. When she walked down the stairs at 7, a fresh copy sat beside the toaster, printed on crisp white cardstock, with updated afternoon instructions. Tessa had added a handwritten note at the bottom regarding evening vacuuming patterns and specific pet grooming times for the golden retriever. Nolan sat at the dining table, scrolling through his phone while spooning oatmeal. He avoided catching his mother's eye, clearly hoping to bypass any domestic tension before his commute. Celeste poured her own coffee, watching her son dodge responsibility with practiced ease. He had always been conflict-averse, preferring to let the women in his life negotiate the emotional terrain of the household. Tessa bustled into the room, balancing a laptop bag and a diaper bag. Her eyes darted immediately to the fresh cardstock, which remained untouched beside the toaster. Her shoulders stiffened visibly. "Celeste, did you look over the afternoon updates the pediatrician called, and Leo needs his gluten-free snack prepared exactly at 3. If we deviate from the schedule, his entire digestive rhythm is thrown off and then nobody sleeps." "Leo is 3 years old. Tessa, not a laboratory experiment," Celeste replied mildly, buttering a piece of toast. "He will be fine with an apple slice and a glass of milk at whatever time he asks for it." Tessa stopped packing her bag, her expression turning icy. This isn't about arbitrary rules, it's about efficiency. Nolan and I built our careers on structure. When you agreed to stay here, we assumed you understood that keeping a home requires strict adherence to systemized protocols. Otherwise, chaos wins. Celeste looked across the table at Nolan, who suddenly found a fascinating notification on his phone screen. The silence stretched thin, heavy, with the unspoken assumption that Celeste's time, energy, and retirement belonged entirely to the operational needs of her adult children. Celeste set her knife down softly, deciding right then that she would not spend her golden years marching to someone else's beat. Chapter 3. The First Shift. On Friday, the afternoon sun slanted warmly across the hardwood floor of the sunroom, where Celeste sat with little Leo reading an illustrated book about forest animals. The laminated schedule sat untouched on the kitchen counter, ignored for the second consecutive day. Tessa had left detailed instructions for the basement laundry to be sorted, bleached, and folded by 4 o'clock, so the uniforms would be ready for the weekend. Instead of heading down to the basement, Celeste took Leo by the hand and walked out to the back porch to plant a small tray of cold, hardy pansies in an empty ceramic pot. Gardening had always grounded her, offering a quiet rhythm dictated by soil and weather rather than corporate management strategies. She taught Leo how to press the dark earth gently around the green roots, their fingers sharing the same dusting of rich, black soil. When Nolan walked through the back door at 6 o'clock, his briefcase slung over one shoulder, he stopped short by the patio steps. He looked past his mother and son toward the utility room, noticing the overflowing laundry basket sitting precisely where Tessa had left it 3 hours earlier. A frown crossed his face, though he kept his voice low to avoid waking the sleeping baby upstairs. "Mom," Nolan said, stepping onto the porch hesitantly. "Tessa's going to check the laundry app when she gets home. She left very specific instructions about the cycle temperatures. You know how stressed she gets when things fall behind." Celeste wiped her hands on a small rag, looking up at her son with a calm, unreadable expression. "Nolan, the laundry will be washed when I have finished what I am doing here. My time is no longer measured by your wife's color-coded lists." Nolan rubbed the back of his neck, looking genuinely uncomfortable. "She just wants everything to run smoothly, Mom. She feels like you're pulling away from the family unit." There is a vast difference between being part of a family and being an unpaid employee, Celeste said quietly, picking up the garden trowel. "I love you both, but I am a guest here by choice, not an indentured servant by contract." Nolan opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again, realizing his mother's quiet resolve was far stronger than his weak attempts at mediation. He walked inside just as Tessa's car pulled into the driveway, bracing himself for the inevitable storm that was brewing in the kitchen. Chapter 4. The Escalating Pressure. Saturday morning brought a cold drizzle against the window panes, matching the frosty atmosphere inside the house. Tessa had spent 20 minutes reorganizing the pantry before breakfast, muttering under her breath about misplaced spice jars and illogical shelving habits. When Celeste entered the kitchen to brew her tea, Tessa intercepted her with a clipboard in hand, looking exhausted and defensive. "Celeste, we need to talk about expectations," Tessa said, her voice sharp as she tapped the clipboard. "Last night, when I asked why the linens weren't pressed, Nolan just shrugged. That is unacceptable. We invited you here for mutual support during a high-stress transition period in our careers. Instead, you act like a tourist in your own son's home." Celeste poured hot water over her tea bag, watching the amber liquid darken before she turned to face her daughter-in-law. "Tessa, I am 64 years old. I spent 40 years managing a hospital ward where lives depended on precision. I retired so I could finally breathe without a checklist dictating every minute of my existence." Tessa's face flushed with a mixture of fatigue and indignation. "A hospital ward? Really? So keeping a household running smoothly is beneath you. My mother used to come over and clean my entire kitchen without being asked. She understood what family support actually means. Your mother made her choices. I am making mine," Celeste replied steadily. "I am here to love my grandchildren and enjoy my son, not to submit to performance evaluations in my retirement years." From the doorway, Nolan watched the exchange with wide eyes paralyzed by the conflict. He stepped forward weakly, trying to smile. "Hey, let's all calm down. Mom, maybe just try to follow a few of the guidelines. Tessa, maybe loosen up on the schedule a bit. We can compromise." "There is no compromise. when one person dictates the terms of another person's freedom," Celeste said softly. Tessa slammed the clipboard onto the counter, the sharp plastic sound echoing through the quiet kitchen. "This isn't about freedom, Celeste. This is about basic decency and teamwork. If you aren't going to contribute to the household infrastructure, then why are you even here?" Celeste didn't blink or raise her voice. She simply took a sip of her tea, letting the silence settle heavily over the room. The illusion of family harmony had completely shattered, leaving bare the stark reality of what Tessa truly expected from her mother-in-law. Chapter 5. The Turning Point. Sunday afternoon offered no relief from the tension, as Tessa maintained a glacial silence throughout lunch, speaking only in monosyllables when handing plates across the table. Nolan spent the entire meal staring intently into his soup bowl, utterly defeated by the domestic Cold War. Celeste observed them both with clear-eyed detachment, realizing that staying in this environment any longer would erode her own peace of mind entirely. Upstairs in the guest room, Celeste packed her canvas duffel bag methodically. She folded her sweaters with the same care she had always used, but her mind was entirely focused on her own life back in Madison. She thought of her quiet townhouse overlooking the park, her own morning routine, and the freedom of waking up without someone else's agenda waiting at the breakfast table. The emotional wound of Tessa's words was real, but it did not break her. Celeste refused to shed tears over a power struggle born of her daughter-in-law's control issues and anxiety. Instead, a quiet clarity settled over her spirit. She had spent decades rescuing others in the hospital and managing domestic crises. Now, she was going to rescue her own retirement from becoming an extension of someone else's corporate anxiety. Before zipping her bag, Celeste opened her small leather purse and retrieved a thick envelope containing the cash she had set aside for a planned weekend trip with the grandchildren, a trip Tessa had already canceled because it didn't fit the matrix. She pulled out a pen and wrote a concise, polite note, leaving it face up on the wooden dresser. She walked downstairs, her footsteps light and deliberate against the stairs. Nolan was sitting alone in the living room, nervously tapping his fingers against the armrest of the sofa, while the television played softly in the background. Tessa was upstairs in the nursery, presumably rewriting her precious checklist to account for perceived insubordination. Celeste stopped by the living room entrance, her duffel bag resting comfortably over one shoulder. Nolan looked up, his expression instantly shifting from confusion to mild panic as he registered the luggage. He stood up quickly, his voice tight with sudden apprehension. "Mom, where are you going? What's in that bag?" Celeste looked at her son with a calm, steady gaze that demanded his full attention. "Nolan, your wife made her expectations perfectly clear yesterday. My retirement does not belong on her spreadsheet, and I refuse to live my life under a mandatory list of orders." Chapter 6. The Independent Plan. Nolan took a step toward his mother, his hands raised in a placating gesture as panic flickered in his eyes. "Wait, Mom, you can't just leave." Tessa was just venting. She's sleep-deprived and overwhelmed with the baby. She didn't mean it literally. Just give it another week, things will settle down once we get used to the new neighborhood routine. Nolan, stop making excuses for behavior that stems from entitlement. Celeste said, her voice firm yet gentle. Tessa operates under the belief that my time is an available resource for her convenience. When I said no, she took it as a personal insult rather than a boundary. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a fundamental difference in how we view mutual respect. Nolan swallowed hard, realizing his mother was completely serious. "What will you do?" "How are you getting back to Madison? Let me drive you." "No need," Celeste interrupted smoothly. "I already called a rideshare service. It will be here in 10 minutes. I am perfectly capable of managing my own travel arrangements, just as I have managed my own life for the past 6 decades. Nolan ran a hand through his hair, looking genuinely distressed as the weight of his passive neutrality finally crashed down on him. "Tessa is going to lose her mind when she comes downstairs and finds out you left. She's going to blame me for not stopping you. That is a conversation between you and your wife. Celeste replied evenly. For years, you have used your avoidance to let others handle the friction in your life. It is time for you to stand up as a husband and a father, rather than expecting everyone else to bend to accommodate your family's operational stress. The sound of a car horn chiming softly from the driveway signaled the arrival of the rideshare. Celeste adjusted the strap of her duffel bag, giving her son a final, compassionate look. She was not angry anymore. She simply possessed the quiet strength of a woman who knew her own worth and refused to negotiate it away for the sake of forced family peace. Tell the children I love them, Celeste said quietly, turning toward the front door before Nolan could muster another defense. My door in Madison is always open for visits, but only under conditions of mutual respect. Goodbye, Nolan. Chapter 7. The Miscalculated Assumption. Upstairs, Tessa heard the front door click shut and the muffled rumble of a vehicle pulling away from the curb. Frowning, she set down the baby monitor and hurried down the hallway, assuming Celeste was merely taking the children for a walk to the neighborhood park despite the drizzle. She reached the bottom of the stairs just as Nolan stood alone in the entryway, staring blankly at the open front door with a look of utter disbelief. Where is she? Tessa asked sharply, her eyes darting around the empty hallway. Did she take the baby out? In this weather, I specifically scheduled indoor sensory play. For this hour, according to the Matrix. Nolan turned slowly to face his wife, his expression cold and uncharacteristically steady. She didn't take the baby, Tessa. She took her bag and went back to Madison. Tessa scoffed, crossing her arms over her chest with an incredulous laugh. Back to Madison. Don't be ridiculous. Her return ticket isn't for another 3 weeks. She's probably just sulking in the backyard or walking down to the corner store to prove some stubborn point. She'll be back by dinner. No, she won't, Nolan said, his voice dropping into a flat, heavy register. She called an Uber. She's gone, Tessa. And honestly, I don't blame her. Tessa's laughter cut off abruptly as she read the expression on her husband's face. The reality of the situation began to set in replacing her annoyance with a sudden spike of panic and indignation. What do you mean you don't blame her? I gave her a clear, structured framework so we could all function efficiently. She sabotaged our household support system because she couldn't be bothered to follow a simple set of guidelines. Guidelines. Nolan repeated, a bitter edge entering his voice for the first time. Tessa. It was a laminated chore list for a retired guest who came here to visit her family. You treated my mother like a hired maid, and you expected her to just swallow her dignity and obey every order. I expected teamwork, Tessa shouted, her voice rising in defensive anger. We are drowning here. Nolan, between my firm deadlines and the children, I needed someone to pick up the slack. She has nothing else to do with her time. Her retirement belongs to her family. Nolan stared at his wife, finally seeing the sheer selfishness of her logic laid bare. For the first time, he did not fold, nod, or try to smooth things over. He simply walked past her toward the kitchen, leaving Tessa standing alone in the hallway as the silence of the oversized house pressed in around her. Chapter 8. The Collapse of Order. With Celeste gone, the fragile illusion of Tessa's perfectly controlled household disintegrated within 48 hours. Without an extra pair of hands to absorb the endless stream of childcare duties and domestic chores, the daily schedule Tessa had so meticulously crafted collapsed under its own weight. The laundry piled high in the utility room, the kitchen sink overflowed with unwashed bottles, and both children fussed incessantly because their mother was too busy trying to keep up with her own spreadsheets to offer genuine attention. Nolan shared the essential childcare and household duties, but he refused to follow Tessa's rigid schedules or accept her unreasonable demands. When Tessa snapped at him during breakfast on Tuesday morning because the dishwasher wasn't loaded to her exact spatial specifications, Nolan simply set down his coffee cup and looked her straight in the eye. I'm done playing middle management to your rules, Tessa, Nolan said quietly, his voice devoid of its usual hesitation. My mother was right. You didn't want a family member visiting, You wanted an assistant. And because you drove her away with your demands, we are dealing with the mess entirely on our own. Tessa's eyes flashed with furious tears of exhaustion and rejection. So, you're blaming me? I'm trying to keep our lives from falling apart. If your mother had just shown a little bit of flexibility and cooperation. My mother gave us 40 years of her life raising me and working in a hospital. Nolan interrupted, his tone unyielding. Her retirement belongs to her, not to your master schedule. You broke the relationship because you couldn't stand losing control over someone else's time. The argument hung heavy in the air, leaving Tessa with no witty retort, no color-coded defense, and no laminated chart to fix the emotional wreckage. For the first time, she realized that her insistence on absolute obedience had cost her more than just a free babysitter. It had alienated her husband and broken the trust of a woman who had come to offer love, not servitude. That evening, sitting alone at the kitchen table amid a mountain of unopened mail and unwashed dishes, Tessa finally looked down at the laminated chore list she had left beside Celeste's mug days ago. With trembling fingers, she picked it up, walked over to the recycling bin, and dropped it inside. The house was chaotic, loud, and thoroughly imperfect, but the rigid prison she had built for everyone else had finally collapsed around her. Chapter 9. 3 days later, Tessa pounded on Celeste's door. The season's first scattered snowflakes swirled in the freezing air around her as she stood on the porch in her coat, shivering from a mix of exhaustion and desperate frustration. The house behind her had dissolved into complete chaos, and her control had utterly shattered. She needed someone to blame, someone to force back into the rigid routine she had constructed. Celeste pulled the door open, her expression calm, wearing a comfortable cardigan over a soft shirt. She looked entirely at peace in her sunlit townhouse in Madison, far away from any spreadsheets or morning color-coded matrix charts. The moment Celeste opened it, Tessa shouted, "How dare you walk out and leave us with this mess?" Celeste did not flinch, nor did she raise her voice to match the frantic pitch echoing in her entryway. She simply stood in the doorway, blocking the cold draft, with quiet, unshakable dignity. "I didn't leave a mess, Tessa. I left a situation where I was treated like an employee rather than a mother." "You ruined everything!" Tessa cried, tears of sheer helplessness spilling over her lashes. "The children are crying. The house is falling apart, and Nolan refuses to follow the system. You were supposed to help us run this family." "I came to visit my family, not to run an institution," Celeste replied softly, her voice steady and clear. "You demanded obedience, but relationships require mutual respect. Until you understand the difference, you cannot command my time." Tessa stared at her mother-in-law, the fury suddenly draining out of her, leaving behind only the heavy realization that her rigid demands had driven away the very support she desperately needed. Celeste gently closed the door halfway, offering a final calm look of understanding before stepping back into her warm, independent home. Chapter 10. The New Boundary. 2 months passed before the tension between the households finally dissolved into a new, healthier normal. Tessa had spent weeks attending counseling sessions to address her underlying anxieties about control and perfectionism, slowly learning that a happy home is measured by warmth and laughter, rather than color-coded efficiency charts. Nolan and Tessa had learned to share domestic responsibilities, equally ensuring that neither partner was crushed beneath the weight of unrealistic expectations. In her sunlit townhouse in Madison, Celeste sat by the window with a warm mug of chamomile tea, painting a watercolor landscape of the park outside her balcony. Her retirement belonged entirely to her, now filled with art classes, gardening, and quiet mornings unburdened by anyone else's agenda. She had not sought revenge or engaged in petty retaliation. She had simply reclaimed her life through calm conviction and decisive action. On a crisp Saturday morning in December, the doorbell of the Madison townhouse chimed softly. Celeste set down her paintbrush and walked to the front door, opening it to find Nolan, Tessa, and the children standing on her welcome mat. Tessa looked different, softer, more grounded, and genuinely humbled, holding a small potted pansy instead of a clipboard. "Hi, Mom," Tessa said softly, her voice carrying a quiet sincerity that had been missing months before. "We didn't bring any schedules this time. We just wanted to see if you had time to share a cup of tea and bake some cookies with the kids." Celeste smiled warmly, stepping aside to let her family cross the threshold into a home defined by mutual respect rather than demands. She had taught them both a lesson without ever raising her voice. True connection only begins where control ends, and a mother's love is a gift freely given, never an order to be obeyed. I wish you both peace as you build a life together in your new home.